Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Science Division Live presented here by the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. My name is Alyssa Carlson, and I am a program specialist at DMNS. Today, I'm joined in the studio by our producer, Kim Evans, and our presenter, Kathryn Reusch. Kathryn is the conservation technician in our anthropology collections in the Avenir Collection Center at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Today, Kathryn will be giving a presentation called Dead Men Tell No Tales, Palaeopathological Conditions in Skeletal Human Remains. I invite all of you joining us today on Facebook, type your questions for Kathryn in the comments. We will try to answer some of them at the end of the presentation. So without any further ado, Kathryn, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kathryn Reusch. And so just to start out as a kind of a blanket warning, because we are talking about pathological conditions and human remains, there are going to be photos of people, or human remains, skeletons mostly, and people with sometimes very severe pathological conditions. So please do keep that in mind as we do this talk. So I'm going to start sharing my screen to do the PowerPoint presentation. I do have notes off to the side, so maybe there are going to be photos of having a look at those. And so to start off, the talk is, yes, Dead Men Tell No Tales, Paleopathological Conditions, and Human Remains. And so some kind of background information that we need for this. There are about 206 bones in the adult human body. Children have a few more because their bones kind of fuse together as they grow. But most adults have about 206 bones in their bodies. So you might have a few more, you might have a few less. It kind of depends on the person. And the other important thing that we need to know, especially in terms of why bones react the way that they do, is that bones are a composite material. They have an organic part, which is mostly collagen, and a few other proteins, and then a mineral component, which is called hydroxyapatite, and that's a form of calcium carbonate. And so basically the calcium carbonate provides a really nice rigid framework, and then the collagen allows the bones to be a little bit flexible, so that, you know, the daily stresses we have of walking and that kind of thing, moving around, don't break our bones because they're entirely mineral and therefore are really fragile. The collagen helps kind of protect them from that, and then the mineral matrix allows it to be a little bit more rigid and actually support our bodies. So because bones have that organic component, that collagen to them, they're living tissues. So your skeleton is actually alive, it's not inert. And so anything that happens during your life will actually affect your skeleton. And that's how we can tell, we can look at human remains and actually get a lot of information from people's human remains, from their skeletons, about what they did during their life. So just as a little bit of, I've shared the wrong screen, I'm sorry. Go to the correct screen and share that. Okay, so just as a little bit of information, there are kind of two major terms that describe what we're talking about today: bioarchaeology and paleopathology. And so bioarchaeology is kind of a broader term, and it's really the study of archaeological human remains. So what do those human remains tell us about people who lived in the past? And this can include things like the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies, what that does to the skeleton. And then paleopathology is a little bit more specific, and it's the study of disease and trauma in those archaeological skeletal populations. So that's things like looking at bones for evidence of joint wear and tear, what's happened to your body over the course of your life. So paleopathology is a little bit more specific. It's looking at some of those medical conditions. So when we talk about this, paleopathology, we have a number of different types of diseases or conditions that can be observed in skeletal remains. We've got congenital conditions. Those are conditions that you're born with, either because something happened when you were growing in the womb, or because of a genetic condition that you have. So it's either conditions that happened when you were in utero or something specific to your particular genetic makeup. Those are congenital conditions. We then have dental disease. That's things going on with your teeth if you don't take care of them during your life. Trauma, these are things like falls, fractures, that kind of thing. Metabolic or dietary conditions, if you're not getting enough of any particular nutrient in your body, that's a metabolic condition when you're eating. chronic infectious disease. Now, we can see some forms of infectious disease in a skeleton, but they have to be what's called chronic, or they have to keep recurring. Something really highly infectious like plague or smallpox or something like that is going to kill you. You either die or you recover from it. It's not really going to leave a lot of marks on your skeleton. But if you have something that's really chronic, it keeps recurring, like syphilis or tuberculosis or something like that, we can actually see that turn up in the skeleton over time as your body reacts to having that illness for a long period of time. Joint disease, this is kind of wear and tear on the joints of your body as you get older. As you get older, you notice you get a little bit more sore, your joints might hurt a little bit more, and that's just kind of wear and tear through the course of your life. And then we can also actually see cancer sometimes in skeletons, and that's either cancer specifically of the bones themselves, or if you've got a form of cancer that's pressed up against your bone, it might affect your bones. So we can see all of those types of diseases or conditions in your skeleton. So some examples of trauma that we can also see in skeletons are fractures, blunt force trauma. If someone hits you with kind of a blunt object like a hammer or a club or something like that, we can see that. We can see evidence of amputations. That's especially in battlefield archaeology, that kind of thing, when you have a population, a cemetery population that comes from battlefield context. You might find a lot of amputations in that population. And then we can also see gunshot and knife wounds. So paleopathology looks at all of these forms of trauma and disease and tries to build a life history of the kind of what this person was going through. And so these are also techniques that can be used in forensic anthropology. So paleopathology, bioarchaeology uses this in historic populations, and forensic anthropology uses it in modern medico-legal cases. But a lot of the methodologies we use are the same. So jumping right into some of those congenital conditions we can see, one that a lot of people might be familiar with is achondroplasia, which is a form of dwarfism. And so this is actually caused by a genetic mutation. And that means that the cartilage in your skeleton, that collagen matrix, that gets laid down and then turns into bone, basically doesn't form correctly in people with achondroplasia. They have a genetic mutation that keeps that cartilage from forming correctly, and not even forming correctly, but even turning into bone. And so this results in kind of torsos that are basically average size, but the arms and legs might be quite short. And so some famous examples of people with achondroplasia include Peter Dinklage, Warwick Davis, Vern Troyer, actors like that. And these are, again, it's a genetic condition. And so that's why it's called a congenital condition, because you're born with it. It's built into the genetics of your body, or it happens in utero. The next congenital condition we're going to talk about is one that happens in utero. And so this is called spina bifida occulta. And we got this example here. This is what actually it looks like in the skeleton. That's the example that we see when paleopathologists are looking at skeletons. We see basically that's the back of the sacrum, which is the bone at the back of your pelvis. It forms the kind of the second to last section of your vertebral column of your vertebrae. And basically in spina bifida, that's not closed over. It would be closed over in most cases, but in spina bifida, what happens is when you're in utero, your mother doesn't have enough folate, which is vitamin B, while she's pregnant. And so what happens is this diagram over here, this is what's called the neural tube. And this is essentially a tube that forms around your spinal cord and eventually becomes your vertebrae or your spinal backbone. And in spina bifida, if you don't have enough vitamin B, you don't have that folate, it actually causes what are called neural tube defects. And the neural tube doesn't close right there where the sacrum is going to form. And so what can happen there is this means that your spinal cord can actually protrude out through your vertebrae. And in some extreme cases, like in this picture here, it can actually protrude out through the skin. And so that can actually cause a lot of damage to an infant during birth, that kind of thing. These days, we would tend to correct this with surgery if it gets discovered. But so this is obviously a really big problem. This is why it's very important for women to have that vitamin B. while they're pregnant. So the problem here is that UV radiation can actually break down folate in our bodies. So if we have too much UV radiation, it can actually break that down. And then if you're not getting enough in your diet, it can cause a lot of problems. So this is actually kind of ties into variations in skin color and is part of why we see variations in skin color across the globe. So you can see here in this picture up here, we tend to have darker skin. We tend to see people with darker skin in areas where you're going to get a lot more sunshine, such as near the equator. Places where it's going to be a lot hotter, a lot more sun. You need that extra little bit of darkness in the skin because the protein that colors skin darker, melanin, actually acts as a natural sunscreen. This is why people who have paler skin, when they get sunburned, if they tan, their skin goes a little bit darker because the skin is actually putting up a little bit more melanin. It's producing more melanin into those skin cells to help protect the body from that UV radiation. So this is part of why we see darker skin in people who tend to be closer to the equator. One of the reasons for it. There's a lot of very complicated reasons for why skin color exists the way it is, but this is one of those reasons. Now, the other reason that we might see lighter skin in people further away from the equator is we're moving now into a metabolic condition, rickets and osteomalacia, and this is a vitamin D deficiency. And so what happens there is your skin, as UVB radiation comes in and hits your skin, it actually produces vitamin D in your skin. And you can get vitamin D through your diet, but it actually seems to work best for us to have it produced in our skin from exposure to sunlight. Well, as you move further away from the equator, especially as it gets into winter and the earth is tilted away from the sun, you get less sunshine during the winter months. And so that means that if you have really dark skin, you're not getting as much vitamin D during the winter. And that can lead to things like rickets, where basically vitamin D helps transport that calcium for that calcium carbonate into our skeletons. So if you don't have as much vitamin D, calcium isn't getting transmitted to your skeleton as well. And so your body forms bones that are more collagen, they're more organic than mineral. Normally it's about a 60-40 balance. But if you don't have as much mineral in the skeleton, what happens is your bones are a little bit more protein, they're a little bit more organic. And so what happens is just under the weight of your body, your bones will start to bend. And so that's what we see here. Osteomalacia, rickets is what it's called when you're a child. Osteomalacia is what it's called when you're an adult. And so this is actually a really, really important reason for one of the reasons why we have lighter skin in people who live closer to the poles, both the North Pole and the South Pole. So those are some of the things that we see in these populations. Now, another pretty famous metabolic condition is scurvy, which is a vitamin C deficiency. This is why, we're always saying, drink your orange juice, get your citrus fruits, because they are high in vitamin C. Lemon is actually one of the highest, will give you kind of the best amount of vitamin C. And so what happens here is vitamin C helps build your connective tissues. So in people who have scurvy, what we see most frequently is just kind of bleeding as their connective tissues break down a little bit. And so you'll get bleeding kind of out across the surface of the bones. And so that can lead to these kind of build up of hard, porous material because the bone is trying to protect itself from that blood that's sitting on the surface. And so it starts to form bone between the blood and the bone itself. And so these are things that you can see. We see it a lot in naval sailors during, the age of exploration and that kind of thing. Pirates, especially, are known for being scurvy people, having a lot of scurvy. And that's just because it's very difficult to keep fresh fruit on months-long voyages across the sea. And so you just wind up with that deficiency in vitamin C. So that's what we see in a lot of these kind of metabolic conditions is it will slowly start to affect your skeleton. It might take a couple months before it really starts showing up in the skeleton. But when it does, it can have some pretty severe consequences. Transitioning to dental disease, we've got kind of two things we're going to talk about here. The first one is what's called malocclusion. And this is just when your teeth don't line up. So if you think of a dental arcade, that the way your teeth are supposed to look, they normally form a really nice arch. And you can see here, this person's teeth are kind of shoved all out of place. This can happen for a number of different reasons. Sometimes your mouth is just a little small. This person actually has their wisdom teeth are shoving their teeth forward, and that's causing part of this misalignment in their teeth. These days, this tends to get treated with orthodontia, especially here in the States. We like having that nice, smooth dental arcade. So this is, someone would normally have braces to correct this these days. The other thing, the reason we correct malocclusion, not just for cosmetic reasons, is that as your teeth don't line up, they can actually start to chip, which can lead to our other form of dental disease we're going to talk about, caries or cavities. So caries is the Latin term that we use for cavities, and it just means decay. And that's really what cavities are, is cavities are when a bit of bacteria, when some bacteria get in past that hard, shiny enamel on your teeth, and then they start to eat away at the inner material of your teeth. And so these can form really deep pockets in your teeth, which can cause a lot of damage. And if they get down to the root of your teeth where your nerves are, they can cause a lot of pain as well. So this is kind of a side view of a couple of cavities coming into this person's teeth. And you can see it's getting down into what's called the pulp chamber, where the root, where the nerves and the blood vessels are in your teeth. And so if that keeps going on, that can get into there. It can cause a lot of pain. It can cause infection, which you really don't want in your bones. Bone infection is not, it's a very serious thing. So this is when bacteria gets in and starts to eat away at your teeth. And what these days, what would happen is your dentist would normally go in, drill out and around and clear out all of that pocket of infection, and then they'll fill it in with a filling so that you have a nice smooth chewing surface, and hopefully the cavity doesn't continue to grow. So that's what we see, and we can see this in a whole bunch of populations all around the world, are these cavities forming. So moving on to trauma that we can see in skeletal populations, we see a lot of fractures. People, if you think of day-to-day life, people do a lot of things. They'll fall off things, they'll run into things, and just you wind up breaking your bone. And so the reason that doctors today straighten them out and then they put you in a cast, I know it can be kind of annoying a lot of times to have one. It actually helps it heal better, because you can see here, this person, their bone wasn't aligned back up. This is what this is an upper arm bone, and this is what it should look like, and this is what this person's looks like. So you can see it's coming in at a very different angle. It should be coming up nice and straight here, and instead it's very angulated. And you can see this person here, these are the lower leg bones, your shin bone, and another bone that tucks in just to the side of it. You can see here, there's a break here and a break here, and this actually, because it didn't get lined up correctly, has shortened the length of that leg. And so this person probably would have walked with a little bit of at least a little bit of a limp. And so that can actually have a lot of knock-on effects with your skeleton. If you think, you're walking with a limp all day, that's going to eventually start wearing away at your hips, wear at your hip joints. And so that can cause a lot more problems further down the line. And so it's really important to have those fractures healed and aligned correctly. But we do see a lot of fractures in archaeological populations, just because, people get injured, and sometimes you can get it aligned and healed correctly, and sometimes you can't. We do have examples of bones where it's been healed, it's been aligned really nicely and healed, and you can't even tell that the person had broken a bone. You find it on an X-ray, which is actually really cool and really interesting. Another form of trauma that not really trauma, but kind of wear and tear. This is joint disease. And so this is vertebrae. These are what form your backbone. And just over time, that will kind of, wear away at the margins, at these edges of the bone. And the joint will actually try to stabilize itself. So it'll try and fuse. Sometimes if people have really bad back problems, they'll have surgery to fuse a couple of vertebrae together. Your body will actually try and physically do that itself if it feels a joint is unstable. And so you can see here, these two vertebrae are actually kind of starting to get to a point where they might almost fuse together into one bone. And you can see here, this person's got a little bit of buildup around the edges of this margin, where this shoulder joint was obviously causing some problems and trying to fuse itself together. So joint disease we can see, and that's just a lot of the times it's everyday wear and tear. Doing a lot of, if you have a very active lifestyle, like you're working on an industrial area or you're working on a farm, that kind of thing, we tend to see that a lot. But we also tend to see it in older people, because again, it's just wear and tear over the course of someone's life. And if you get enough wear and tear, or the cartilage goes over the ends of your bones, we can get what's called Ubernation. And this is where the two two bones in the joint actually start grinding together the bone surface itself, because normally you have a pad of cartilage that lives between the two bone surfaces in your joints. But if that breaks down, wears away, gets thin enough, the bone surfaces themselves can actually rub together. And then we get what's called Ubernation, which is polishing. So you can see here, this bone is actually really shiny. That's because it's been polished so much. And then it's actually cut grooves into the surface of the joint because it's rubbed against itself so much. So we see that also in a lot of archaeological populations. Amputation, it tends to be very obvious. You're just kind of missing the end of the bone. And quite often, if the person survived it, you'll wind up with these kind of healed over where the bones have kind of fused together to help stabilize that area. Really nice, smooth, obvious cuts where it's obviously something has been cut off. So we can see amputations. Switching over to, for our last little section, talking about infectious disease. Now I said smallpox you don't normally see in skeletons, and we don't. Smallpox is extremely virulent. It's a virus. It's extremely deadly. And so if you caught it, you had, I think about it, depending on where you were, a 50 to 75% chance of dying of it. And it's killed a lot of people over time. So smallpox doesn't leave, you'll either die or you'll recover. But it can, if you do recover from it, it can leave you with these kind of pustules and these scars all over your face. And we do sometimes see that in mummies. So sometimes paleopathologists work with mummies as well. And you can sometimes see what look like smallpox scars on the skin of mummies. This particular picture here is actually, it was taken as smallpox lesions, not these holes here, but these kind of bumps on the skin here. It was thought to be smallpox, but when they did some genetic testing, they actually found that this particular individual had hepatitis B instead. But we do see smallpox occasionally in mummies. And then the only other infectious disease I want to talk just a little bit about is poliomyelitis, or poliovirus polio. And this is another highly infectious virus. And what happens with polio is it will actually start to attack your nervous system. So it attacks your nerves. And it can, if it paralyzes, it can cause paralysis when it gets to those nerves. So if it does that, essentially you can't move that limb anymore. So this particular individual has got paralysis in that right leg, and they can't move it anymore because the nerves are dead. So basically what happens is the bones will start to wither, the muscles will start to wither just because they're not being used. It atrophies. And so we actually see that in archaeological populations occasionally. We see it definitely in skeletal populations that are kind of in some of our anatomical museums around the world. And if polio gets into the brainstem or the medulla oblongata at the base of your brain, which controls a lot of kind of the unconscious things that we do, like breathing, heartbeat, it can actually make it difficult for a person to breathe. And so people sometimes wind up living in what are called iron lungs, and it basically kind of compresses the chest and expands and helps that person to breathe. So we do actually see this sometimes in archaeological populations. So this is an individual who had polio in both legs, and it's affected the lower spine, it's affected the hips, and it's kind of caused their legs to kind of curl up into this kind of cross-legged position. And then it's also kind of started eating away a little bit at the bones in the ankles. So polio is another one of these highly virulent infections. And the way that we actually, with a lot of these viruses, quite frequently we find there aren't treatments. There's not a treatment for syphilis, or not syphilis. Syphilis we treat with antibiotics, but there's not a treatment for smallpox. There's not a treatment really to stop it. And so what we've done these days is we've developed vaccines to help us eradicate and keep people from getting the diseases. And so this is kind of that importance of having vaccines and having how science and medicine have really stepped in and helped us handle some of these really deadly infections that we can get over time, that we can kind of trace through our archaeological populations. So these are some of the sources I used, and I think it's time for us to move over to questions.
All right, Kathryn, thank you. We do have a lot of questions here in our Facebook live stream. So to our audience, go ahead and please keep sending in those questions. We'll answer some for about 5 minutes here. One of our first questions is, where do you study this topic and this trauma, and why do we study it?
So there's kind of, if the question is where do you get a degree in this, there are a lot of different universities that can do it. I don't know that CU Denver offers it. I think there are a couple of universities on the East and West Coasts that really specialize in paleopathology itself. If you want to study biological anthropology, a number of the universities here in town offer it. Metropolitan State University offers it. UC Denver offers it. I believe CU Boulder offers physical anthropology. CSU also offers physical anthropology, biological anthropology. I particularly myself studied in the UK. My mother was English, so I took some time and went to university in the UK. There are a number of different universities that do offer it, specifically paleopathology, or you can also study biological anthropology and specialize in paleopathology. What was the rest of the question? Sorry.
And then why do we study paleopathology?
Okay, so part of it is, again, building that sort of biological profile of people. So you don't just, when you're studying paleopathology, you don't just study the diseases, you're also studying, how old was this person likely to be when they died, where did they live? We can actually learn a lot from the skeleton. So it includes things like some of that basic demographic information that you can get, from example, from cemetery records or tombstones, like Dr. Aaron Baxter talked about a couple weeks ago. You can look that video up in our Facebook Live videos as well. But we get a lot of that demographic information. But sometimes, historical records get lost, or someone doesn't have a tombstone or that kind of thing. So sometimes the best way of getting some of this information is to actually get it from the skeleton. And it also means that we can trace some of these diseases through history. If we can recognize them in the skeleton and we can look at it, we can actually understand a little bit better about how certain diseases, certain conditions, how long they've affected the human population, and where maybe they came from, and kind of how they've changed over time, which actually helps us with modern medicine as well. So paleopathology tends to work a lot with modern medicine. They tend to, paleopathologists tend to study a lot of modern medical clinical information as well, to better understand what we're seeing in skeletons. So that's kind of why we study it, is to really understand and trace conditions in the past, and really understand better how and where we as humans have evolved and where we're going.
Great, thank you. Courtney Fritz on Facebook says she's surprised that humans don't all have the exact same number of bones. What causes this discrepancy in the number of bones?
It kind of really depends. So, like, for example, in that joint disease where those two vertebrae are growing together, once they're fully joined together and fused, that would actually be considered one bone. So that sometimes it's things that happen during the course of life. You'll also sometimes get what are called accessory bones. So you'll get, like, at the base of your thumb, you can get a little, or the base of your big toe. You can get it's called a little sesamoid bone, and it's kind of almost like a little button of bone that just sits kind of at the base at one side or the other of a joint. And sometimes it can help stabilize a joint. Sometimes it just forms. Some people form extra ribs. So you might have an extra little rib kind of up at the top or at the bottom of your rib cage. You might have an extra little rib. And so that's kind of where and how. It's just little bits of variation. Sometimes people, their bodies are just super enthusiastic about growing bones, so they get an extra bone or two. Sometimes their bodies are not so enthusiastic, so you might miss a bone. You can also get bones in the so where we have a number of different bones in our skull, and you'll sometimes get extra bones growing between those bones, and they're called sutural bones. It's just kind of they grow in what are called the sutures, the joints of bone in our skull. So we're not really sure why that happens. We haven't really been able to determine why. It's just kind of variation in people.
Great, thank you. Thank you to Courtney for asking that question. All right, one more question. Cassie asks, can you tell when an injury or trauma may have occurred in the individual's life? So breaking your leg in childhood and then living with that break.
Mostly by degree of healing. So the two pictures of fractures that I showed you, the bone was really well formed over. So when you initially break a bone and you go for those 6 to 8 weeks in a cast, and then the doctor takes it off and says, okay, the bone is healed. The bone actually isn't healed. What happens is across that break, you get kind of a little shell of bone forms around it. And that kind of is really encasing it. And then that allows the bone to heal inside that shell. So it's stabilized. The first thing the body does is stabilize that break so that it's not, rubbing or causing extra damage. And then once that's stabilized by forming that callus around the outside, the bone can continue to heal over time. So, 6 to 8 weeks after a break, when the callus is formed, you could still actually really see on an x-ray, it would look almost like the bone hadn't healed at all. You just have that kind of thin callus on the outside of the break. And then as that goes through, it takes probably a good 2 to 3 years to kind of fully, the two bits of bone to actually fully join back up inside the callus. But you might still, have a bump on the bone for a couple of decades after. So you couldn't, necessarily look at a particular break in an individual and say, oh, clearly this happened when they were 2.5 years old because they did this. But you might say, oh, this person had a fracture. It probably happened at least 2 decades before they died because of the degree of healing. So it's kind of, we don't get to talk in absolutes like some other areas of science. Unfortunately, it's kind of estimates a lot of what we do, and that's based on healing, and that can be very individual to people. Some people heal faster, some people heal slower.
That's great. All right. We are out of time for today, but I would like to thank you, Kathryn, for joining us and giving us that great presentation. We will be back again tomorrow here on the Denver Museum of Nature and Science Facebook page for another Science Division Live all about eating insects. So come on back tomorrow at noon and ask your questions. We're excited that you could join us today. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.